Kennedy's biggest problem was this. He is thought of as an indecisive weakling, a scoundrel, or worse, as a result of the accident. People believe he panicked under pressure, that he was out with an unmarried young woman for immoral purposes, and that when he had to face the facts, he lied about his conduct. It is almost conventional wisdom that his explanation of what happened is not credible. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and if you're new, then welcome. I'd like to earn your subscription today. Well, we are doing something very exciting today. We are wrapping up our Chappquiddick series, which I believe we started in September, and it's now January, so go us. I feel very proud of me and you that we made it through this fantastic book, or we will have by the end of this episode. Last time of the inquest had happened, we've gotten Ted's testimony, we've gotten the Boiler Room Girls' testimony, we've gotten Joey Gargan's testimony, and Paul Markham's. Today what we're going to do is wrap up the way the book does. We're going to go through the evidence, and then at the end, I'm going to be sharing my kind of, instead of a Bernie Flynn theory like we've had twice now in the book, I'm going to share my own theory of trying to weave together the evidence we have with my gut feeling of what happened based on the evidence. Chapter 54. Politically, it was disastrous. Just when Kennedy appeared to be reemerging as a possible presidential candidate, public opinion nationwide now turned decisively against the senator, now that the inquest documents are published widely. He's reminded that he had wanted to reveal the full story. Remember, he was just eager to tell the full story, but considered it unwise to do so because of the legal proceedings. Kennedy now reneged on his promised press conference to respond to questions left unanswered. That was last summer, before the inquest, he said. It's all in the transcript now, so I don't have anything more to say. So before the inquest, after the inquest, I'll answer any questions anybody has. Now, after the inquest, no. The inquest transcript, Gwen Kopechne said, was the most difficult and disturbing reading we've ever done. We finally realized how unfortunate it was that we hadn't been allowed to attend the inquest and hear the witnesses firsthand. Because we found in the testimony so many inconsistencies and contradictions, the questioning of witnesses was so incomplete and superficial. It was all left hanging. Nobody seemed to be following the case properly. The district attorney was falling apart, going from question to question. He'd get an answer but didn't follow through. The testimony of the young women had been particularly unsatisfactory. It all sounds alike. It's too pat. I think Judge Boyle might have thought it was rehearsed. From reading the transcript, Joseph Kopechne said, I began to disbelieve in the legal process. To me, it was unbelievable. This is such a terribly sad outcome for them. This is the loss of their daughter. It's the loss of the truth. It's the loss of probably their trust that Senator Kennedy was someone who would be revealing the truth to them. I think probably that dream died on this day. And then, on top of all of that, the legal systems of the country that they love are failing them. State police detective in the DA's office, George Killen, said if Senator Kennedy was at the wheel of that car and he drove down Dyke Road in a certain way, there's no question about his negligence. Not only had Denise kept evidence from the grand jury, but Killen only got to read the case after we couldn't do anything about it. A legal trick had prevented prosecution after the inquest testimony was made public. Killen never suspected that his investigation into the accident had all been betrayed by Bernie Flynn. Privately, Flynn blamed the collapse of the case on Edmund Denise. Flynn agreed. The testimony at the inquest was all rehearsed. Everybody knew what they had to say to corroborate Ted Kennedy. Yeah, and you participated with that, Mr. Flynn. He He even went after Ted. Listen to this. Ted cheated at Harvard and he cheated at the inquest. This is characteristic of the man. It's pretty bold to suddenly be criticizing Ted after you've helped him get away with it. Because the senator's Oldsmobile was a total loss, the insurance company had to pay on it. And at that point, then, the insurance company auctions it off. They owned the car legally. So Edward Hannafy purchases the automobile back from the insurance company to prevent it falling into the hands of a promoter for some display at a freak show like the Chappquiddick death car. A wrecker brings the automobile to Plymouth. They gut it for parts, and then it's crushed into scrap so that there can be no more gathering of evidence and no potential for a, freak show, hey, come see down at the, Edgartown warehouse sort of thing. Joe Grealish, remember, who had helped out with the driver's license fiasco, he was pushing hard for a job for his son. But Smith had some bad news for Grealish. His son wasn't going to get the job. So then, a month later, Grealish had some bad news for Senator Kennedy. On the basis of the facts of the case presented, it would appear that Kennedy did not see the bridge in time and put on his brakes, losing steering ability, and slid off the right side of the bridge. I believe there was operation too fast for existing conditions, Grealish reported. I do not find that the accident occurred without serious fault. So whatever was happening with the job, a month later, the fix is not in. Because there was not a job for his son, perhaps, he decided to be a little less than helpful. He'd already done his bit, maybe. On May 27th, Registrar McLaughlin informed Senator Kennedy, I am unable to find that the fatal accident in which a motor vehicle operated by you was involved was without serious fault on your part. Kennedy's license was revoked for an additional 6 months. On June 11th, Kennedy formally announced his candidacy for re-election. So he's just going right on as if none of that actually matters, as if none of it was a finding of fact, as if none of it reflects on his character. He's just going for re-election as senator. 4 days later, on June 15th, Kennedy was driving in violation of his license revocation, the 35 miles from Boston to Haverhill in less than an hour, despite fairly heavy traffic. So he is driving like a banshee, even without a license. Kennedy was waiting for the start of a parade when a portable cannon was practice fired close by. Doubled up, hands clutching his stomach, Kennedy fell against the car seat and his face drained of color. Moments later, he was smiling and jaunty, marching the 4-mile parade route, waving at crowds lining the curbside. So, this is interesting because this was mentioned actually, I believe in Ask Not, and I don't know if we've heard it in this book, but kind of the ever-present awareness that my first brother was already dead, my second brother was assassinated, my third brother was assassinated, and so I'm the final one. I'm also in politics, and there's this potential for me. And so there's this truly constant, legitimate fear of death that he has, and fear of death particularly by assassination. And so when he's out at a public event and he hears a boom, he doubles up and is traumatized by that, and yet then has to get on with the show, get on with the parade. The senator received a centennial hat at this parade and was proclaimed Kennedy, our next president. So they're still running with that. The senator disclaimed any intentions of seeking the nomination in 1972. He said he would remain in public life as long as I felt that I could be effective in the United States Senate on the issues. A different Ted Kennedy stumped New Bedford in July. His hair was shaggy and graying, wearing a more somber suit, and he was more soft-spoken and reflective. One place that Ted Kennedy would not be seen is the Edgartown Regatta. He was not entered in the 1970 races. I mean, that's probably for the best. What a spectacle that would have been, right? To have him there. I mean, it would be a nonstop Ted Kennedy show if that's what's happening at Edgartown. Yes, I'm still getting my water in. Arena was anticipating at least one TV man will be here to cover the anniversary of the accident. The Kopechnes marked the occasion at their daughter's grave. A bouquet of red and white carnations was sent by Senator Kennedy. Rosemary Keogh carried a basket of daisies to the cemetery. She said, listen to this, she said, "My friend Mary Jo just happened to be in the wrong car at the wrong time with the wrong people." People. Who did she mean? This is the 1-year anniversary. She's moved by emotions. She's not under duress. She's not being coached by lawyers. And this is her statement that she says, that Mary Jo was in the wrong car at the wrong time with the wrong people. We're going to talk about this more in my little theory at the end, but this is worth noting. It's the first post-inquest statement that were given by any of the Boiler Room girls. The Kopechnes receive a check for over $140,000, almost $141,000. Now, there had been a $1 million policy, but that insurance company decided that they would not pay more than $50,000. When the Kopechnes lawyer informed them that they were planning to sue, Senator Kennedy agreed to pay the difference between the $140,000 with the $50,000. And so he paid an additional $90,923 to the Kopechnes. Obviously, Kennedy said, a financial settlement could never compensate the Kopechne family for the loss of their daughter or for the tragedy of the accident. But if there was to be one, I thought it should be fair. Flanagan, their lawyer, also negotiated the sale of Gwen's story to McCall's. Judge Boyles's conclusion that Senator Kennedy had lied when he said that he and Mary Jo had been driving to the ferry leaves a bad taste in our mouths, and we absolutely reject it and any implications that flow from it. So Gwen's still fighting that same old battle, which is, I don't want anybody to believe that my daughter was going away to do immoral things with Ted Kennedy. And so that's her primary goal in this McCall's article, is just to say Judge Boyle was wrong when he said that they weren't intending to go to the ferry, because of course they were. They were trying to go to the ferry. She says her daughter hadn't been involved in a romance over the regatta weekend. Among her boyfriends, there was not one named Senator Edward Kennedy. I mean, as if she would know. You know, a girl that's off living by herself and engaged in any sort of relationships or multiple relationships isn't necessarily informing her mother about those, particularly if there was any impropriety. So I'm not sure that that article carries any weight. That's an emotional argument again that we're seeing from Gwen. Mrs. Kopechne was convinced that the senator had done all he could. We also believe the senator was in shock when he started back to the cottage after his unsuccessful rescue attempt. If his judgment hadn't been impaired, we are certain that he would have tried to get immediate help at one of the houses along the way. Although the senator was obviously distraught, Joseph Gargan and Paul Markham had been in full possession of their senses. Mr. Kopechne and I have been very disturbed by their actions. Why did they assume that Mary Jo was dead and then not seek help? Well, Chappquiddick exacted a price in the election. There were over 100,000 blank votes, meaning people did not vote for anybody. This reduced Kennedy's victory percentage to 58%, far short of his 1964 plurality. You could say on the one hand, well, he still won. Yes, but this actually is a rebuke, and I've employed this kind of voting from time to time. When there's a candidate that I find offensive, to vote, for example, in this case, Democrat all the way down the ballot, but leave that senator spot open. I'm not voting for Ted Kennedy. It sends a message to the party that there were this many people who were willing to vote Democrat on all of these other things, but did not want this particular candidate. Now, in this case, he goes on to win, but it can be a means of rebuke for the party itself to take note of people who say, yeah, I'm normally with you, but on this particular candidate, he or she doesn't have my support. On November 27th, Kennedy went to Plymouth to undergo a full driver's license examination. He passed and received his license. For all practical purposes, the consequences of Chappquiddick were now over. I mean, for him. Edmund Denise had been confident he would be reelected as DA. He was wrong. A different man, Philip Rawlins, wins the seat, and it was called an upset victory. It was more a repudiation of Denise, the New Bedford Standard Times opined, than a vote of endorsement for this unknown. Denise didn't think that Senator Kennedy had played a direct role in his defeat, but privately, Denise was bitter to have saved Ted Kennedy's career by preventing a grand jury from charging him with manslaughter at the expense of his own career. He perceived a singular irony in the senator's reelection. The girl died, and I got defeated. That is funny, that the DA, who the whole time was waffling, the whole time he's trying to walk this line, I think, of pretending to do his job, but ultimately bending when necessary to give Ted Kennedy the slip. Well, after the election, documents, photos, and files, all regarding Chappquiddick, start to go missing. In the DA's office, they're suffering losses. The Department of Motor Vehicles lost certain reports and files. So George Killen sets about recollecting all the documents that he could. But it wasn't just the files going missing. This is interesting and kind of creepy. Joseph Flanagan telephones the DA's office, that's the Kopechne's lawyers, to inquire about the return to the parents of Mary Jo Kopechne of any exhibits that were introduced at the inquest, which belonged to her, specifically the clothing she had worn on the night she was killed. I couldn't figure out what the hell the Kopechnes wanted their daughter's clothes back for in the first place, Killen said. To his amazement, he receives an order for all exhibits introduced at the inquest to be returned to whom they respectively belong, specifically including exhibit number 5, which was 1 white long-sleeve button-front blouse or shirt, 1 pair color blue slacks, 1 bra, blue trim, 1 pair of leather sandals. 2 days later, Flanagan calls the DA's office. Rather than receiving the clothes, the Kopechnes wanted them destroyed. Killen was loath to do it. He's the police investigator. He doesn't want to get rid of anything. This is evidence. He knows. But with a court order, he has no choice. And so Mrs. Kopechne specifically had requested that the specific articles of clothing be destroyed. And Flanagan says for Killen to let him know when the DA's office had complied. So on Tuesday, November 16th, 1971, year and a half after the accident, Killen went to the basement of Barnstable Courthouse accompanied by Bernie Flynn and a custodian. As Killen reported to Flanagan, the clothing and sandals were sprayed with lighter fluid prior to being thrown into the fire to ensure total burning. That's chapter 54. So chapter 54 observations are these. Ted decides now, since he's done the inquest, he's not going to answer any more questions or give any more public information. You all have the inquest, just read it. That's his statement. Number 2 is that the Kopechnes were shocked by the inquest report, and they are specifically angry at Gargan and Markham because they were aware, whereas they give Ted Kennedy the, I think, undue reasoning that he was just in shock. They also are appalled at the Boiler Room Girl's pat answers. Senator Kennedy's Oldsmobile was destroyed. Ted Kennedy loses his license for 6 months and yet still drives. The Kopechnes get a financial statement of $140,000. Ted Kennedy is re-elected, but Edmund Denise is defeated. And the Kopechnes requested that Mary Jo's clothes be burned. So they were. Chapter 55. One immediate consequence of Chappquiddick was Kennedy's defeat in January 1971 as the Senate Majority Whip. He admitted it hurt like hell to lose. What hurt even more was the collapse of his presidential prospects. William F. Buckley wrote, "What he now faces is a long struggle. His assets are his name, his talent, and his wealth. His liabilities are Chappquiddick." Efforts to rehabilitate his political career were already underway. Kennedy had faced up to the humiliation of being called a coward and a liar. He tried not to think about being president. He said, "I don't discuss it with my family. We just don't talk about it." But even the most partisan of his supporters were uneasy as they assessed Kennedy's temperament and character. Historian James McGregor Burns observed, "Chappquiddick is the issue that will not die. Nothing has been learned about the accident to challenge Kennedy's characterization of his behavior as anything but indefensible." Chappquiddick had forced Kennedy, he wrote, to come to grips with himself, a self-confrontation which had brought iron into his soul. I mean, maybe in some portions of his soul. But do we really see that? I think my understanding is he goes on with lascivious and lewd behavior for decades after this. So I'm not sure how much self-confrontation was actually happening. A pollster's test of voter attitudes published by Harper's Magazine in July of 1972 revealed that the stigma not only persisted, quote, "it may be getting worse." 70% of the people polled expressed the view that Kennedy did not tell the truth about what happened at Chappquiddick. Nevertheless, the professionals in the political sphere are looking at Kennedy's chances. They all knew, look, he's powerful, his name is big, and he's had two brothers in the presidential sphere that have been assassinated. So we need not to write this guy out. A tough, shrewd former lobbyist for liberal causes named Joseph Walsh secured a copy of the inquest transcript and submitted a confidential memorandum. In 1971, he wrote it this way: "Kennedy's biggest problem was this. He is thought of as an indecisive weakling, a scoundrel, or worse, as a result of the accident. People believe he panicked under pressure, that he was out with an unmarried young woman for immoral purposes, and that when he had to face the facts, he lied about his conduct. It is almost conventional wisdom that his explanation of what happened is not credible." Yeah, that is clear and compelling. That's quite the memo. If Kennedy were a candidate, he could expect Chappquiddick to be brought up repeatedly. The Nixon White House had a file of information about the accident, nickel and dime stuff, Kennedy said. People start urging Ted Kennedy, in his capacity as a senator, to go ahead and claim jurisdiction on one of his committees to oversee procedures and practices regarding the burglary at the DNC headquarters that happened at Watergate. He hesitated to become involved in a political scandal coming so close upon the heels of his own. Yeah. This is crazy, y'all. So the Watergate burglar, who I forgot, this is E. Howard Hunt. That name we'll come right back to, but he had spent time investigating Chappquiddick. Under the alias Albert Patterson, Hunt had written the clerk of the Edgartown Superior Court on December 3rd, 1971, to inquire about the availability of several exhibits connected with the Kennedy Kopechne inquest. He was seeking a good, clear copy of scuba diver John Farrar's drawing of Mary Jo Kopechne underwater, the one we've referred to so often, and the operator's report of the accident that Kennedy had filed. So the thing I wanted to say about E. Howard Hunt is the more that I've learned about the JFK assassination, this name is involved in that. Hunt, I believe, had a apartment or a suite at the Dow Tex building, which is right catty corner from the Texas School Book Depository. So if the Texas School Book Depository is here and Kennedy comes down this way, Dow Tex is right here. And it's one of the buildings that people did identify potential shots as having come from. E. Howard Hunt is also one that supposedly made some deathbed confessions to his own children that he was involved in the JFK assassination. So I was just surprised to see his name here, and particularly because it involves a Kennedy, that he was there doing digging to get data on Kennedy and had been investigating. Until all the facts of Chappaqiddick were known, Kennedy was the last person in the country, Senator Barry Goldwater said, to lecture us on Watergate. Yeah, he would do well to stay out because, of course, those kinds of things are way too easy. That if it doesn't matter who's telling you, go and, be a part of this. It's like, no, you can't lecture us. You have no credibility. We all see who you are. Polls were reporting Kennedy as the first choice, though, for the 1976 nomination. A majority of Democrats, including the Kopechnes, wanted him to do so. They said they harbored no bitterness toward Senator Kennedy. We have only pleasant feelings about him. We wish him well. Only pleasant feelings. Can you imagine that? I cannot. Even if you felt like somebody had not actually personally done anything wrong and had no part in the problem of your daughter's death, can you imagine saying you had nothing but pleasant feelings toward him? I cannot imagine that. For me, that would be a lie. While some aspects of the Chappquiddick investigation could have been handled better, they said, it's all over now. These shocking, terrible accidents do happen. I actually wrote, as a narcissist can sometimes do, they were hoovered right back in. So whatever happened, I guess the money, maybe he made some kind of private statement, but he never did give them the facts of the case. But for whatever reason, they were hoovered right back in, and they kind of addressed their anger toward the investigators and toward Joey Gargan and Paul Markham. With operatives spreading word that Ted Kennedy was definitely running for president, a climate of gloom was enveloping the Democratic Party. They believed that the stain of Chappaqiddick would defeat Kennedy in a general election. He appeared on Face the Nation in 1974, and Kennedy denied that the incident would have any bearing on his political future. There's a full response, and the inquest has been made public, he said. I would expect that people are going to have to make a judgment out of it, and I'm prepared to go to the people, were I a candidate, and be judged. With the Kennedy candidacy all but declared, the 5th anniversary of Chappaqiddick brought a flood of retrospectives about the accident. The most devastating was a replication of the case by Robert Sherrill. He was a Washington correspondent for The Nation. He said that it was a multi-layered, complex mystery that remains as baffling today as it was 5 years ago. He provided a case study of how famous politicians, by delays, obfuscation, propaganda, tricks, and wiles, can kill somebody under mysterious circumstances and still regularly receive more than 40% of the support in presidential preference polls. Yeah. Kennedy's press secretary pointed out that 125 to 200 of the nation's best reporters had all looked into Chappaqiddick and have found nothing beyond the record. So, Chapter 55 observations are: Senator Kennedy is no longer the majority whip in the Senate. Image rehabilitation was well underway. Character issues linger and even increase as a concern. The CIA's Howard Hunt is digging for evidence and intel against Ted from the Chappaqiddick evidence files. And there is brutal coverage at the 5-year anniversary. Chapter 56. Mary Jo Kopechne was not the only casualty of that tragic accident. It also made a wreckage of Kennedy's presidential hopes. Citing family responsibilities, Kennedy announced on September 23, 1974, his firm, final, and unconditional decision not to seek the presidency in 1976. Had Kennedy sought the nomination, his most obvious problem is Chappaqiddick and the still unexplained discrepancies between his story and what seems to be indisputable facts, wrote McCalls in November of 1974. Chappaqiddick would have neutralized Watergate as a Democratic attack weapon. Yes, you can't use Watergate as an attack weapon when there's Chappaqiddick on this side. You gotta deal with Chappaqiddick and get it off the table so that you can use Watergate as your primary jab against the opponent. The lingering doubts about the accident had threatened a bitter, nasty, mudslinging campaign. Already battle lines were being drawn and bumper stickers appeared Nobody drowned at Watergate. Yeah, I've actually seen I'll put it up here. There's a VW ad that was spoofed in, was it Mad Magazine or some satire magazine that was about Chappquiddick also. So people are starting to use Chappquiddick regularly as a cultural reference point. Senator Kennedy granted a 2-hour interview to a team of investigative reporters to discuss the accident for the first time since the inquest. He continued to insist that his version of the accident was accurate. The widespread skepticism was unwarranted and justified, he said. I attempted during the course of the inquest to respond to these questions completely, candidly, honestly, and to the best of my ability. His conduct had been irrational and indefensible, and inexcusable and inexplicable. Okay, stop right there. If you don't know about this, you want to know about this. There is a group of men called the Behavior Panel. They're 4 men who each have, I think some of them have like military backgrounds. I think a couple have like business backgrounds, but they are behavior specialists who are very good at coaching. So they've apparently, some of them have worked with like intel sources, or some have done military interrogations to watch behaviors. Some help like CEOs and businessmen to present their companies and their circumstances in favorable ways. So they kind of coach behavior, but they also know how to look at the tells that exist. So when somebody is lying, you can't always tell exactly that they're lying, but there are behaviors that lead observers to a likely possibility that something that you've shared has been deceptive. And so one of those things is when you use repeated words that all mean the same thing. I forget their word for it, but that he says, I had answered these questions completely, candidly, honestly, and to the best of my ability. Well, completely and candidly and honestly all basically mean the same thing. And then irrational, indefensible, inexcusable, inexplicable. Well, irrational and inexplicable mean the same thing, and indefensible and inexcusable mean the same thing. So he is it's as if what you're doing is mounting up evidence on this side to heap up how good you are, to heap up how much you're telling the truth. And it actually is a sign that you're not. So having those together just made me laugh a little bit. Kennedy cleared up none of the contradictions in this interview, of course. The Globe concludes, after doing a 4-part investigative series, they say preferential treatment by law enforcement and judicial officials saved Kennedy from being charged with serious crimes, including manslaughter. Justice was not served, hard questions were not asked of witnesses, and complaints and indictments were not pursued. Of course, Kennedy says these accounts are unfair, untrue, and ugly. The real story has been told, Ted said. They're not going to find other kinds of facts because they just don't exist. I mean, okay, or is it because the facts have been sufficiently buried now that we're 5 years out and you're stuck with what you said? That's where I sit with this, is that at this point, he's just going with the story that he has to because that's where he sits, but none of this is giving greater clarity. He doesn't give greater clarity to the press, which actually, if he wasn't running for president, would be totally fine with me. You can go off into your private life and keep yourself to yourself, and that's one of the rights that we have as Americans, is you don't have to self-incriminate, and you don't have to go on living the rest of your life in light of that if you don't wish to. Once you've been found innocent, which he hadn't. He had been found negligent and responsible, but just not pursued. But let's just, for the sake of that argument, say he could have withdrawn into private life and wouldn't have owed anybody an interview. But he did owe Gwen and Joe Kopechne the truth, and he never gave that. He says the real story has been told, but none of us have heard it, including them. The unanswered questions about Chappquiddick had left Gwen Kopechne angry and frustrated. She says, sometimes I'd like to scream a lot, but I'm trying to hold it back. It would be nice if somebody would speak up. The Kopechnes came to Edgartown in June 1975. to seek answers to the case for themselves. Crossing on the ferry to Chappquiddick, Gwen Kopechne pointed out the public telephone in the ferry house at the landing. Joseph Kopechne said, "I was rather afraid of what her reaction would be when we went up to Dyke Bridge. In fact, she reminded me of what part the bridge the car went over. I had clean forgotten." Among those they tracked down, you and I have the internet. We have photos. We have drone footage flying over the bridge. We have aerial photos and from the scene photos, and we've seen it all here. They were limited to whatever they had seen in the inquest, which I don't believe was much. I think a lot was not entered as evidence for that. It was not a typical court case. And then perhaps they had seen some news coverage, but even that, at this time, you couldn't go back and pull it up. So whatever they had seen on a random, 1-year anniversary or whatever, so they are pretty starved for information when they get there onto the island. Among those that they tracked down was Huck Look. Resigned to having his story questioned, he said, "It just becomes a thing of credibility. Look, if you want to believe him, fine. If you want to believe me, I've got nothing to gain in any way, shape, or form." Evidently, Edgartown believed Look because they reelected him as sheriff. Look said he would never live long enough to believe he hadn't seen Ted Kennedy's car going down Dyke Road an hour and a half after the senators said the car went off Dyke Bridge. "He's so sure of what he saw that it really makes me think better about what might have happened," Joseph Kopechne said. "It looks to me like there's a lot of unanswered questions now that I look at it objectively. The senator gave me the story. I believed it. It's possible. But at the same time, I didn't have any questions to ask him," Mrs. Kopechne said. "I was only listening to anybody that would say anything to me. Now I think I would give a little argument. Now I'd have something to say." The Kopechnes hesitated before they went into the turf and tackle shop where John Farrar worked. After all the inconsistencies and evasions, Farrar was more convinced than ever that the truth had not come out. Mary Jo could have been saved, he felt, if rescue personnel and equipment had been called immediately. "I know she suffocated when her oxygen ran out. She didn't drown." Mrs. Kopechne told a local freelance journalist, "I felt that boy is experienced enough so that he can make those statements. He convinced me real good. No matter how you look at it, it was an accident. What hurts me deep is to think that my daughter had to be left there all night. This is why we hold so bitter a feeling towards Markham and Gargan." Do you see how she replaces who she really ought to be angry at? "I think Kennedy made his statement when he was still confused. In the state he was in, I do believe he couldn't think clearly. I think he was taking all this bad advice, and it just continued for days. He got so deeply involved in it, he couldn't back out and just tell the truth. Now how is he going to change his story? Now he's in worse trouble than he would have been if he had just come out and given the story himself without anybody advising him." So she's still doing like mental gymnastics to somehow keep Ted Kennedy as this upstanding, wonderful senator with whom they have this relationship while having this set of facts. We call this cognitive dissonance. I've gone through it in my life at one particular time, and it is a troubling burden to labor under, to know someone has all the look of having done harm, and yet your whole moral compass is designed to believe well of them. But all the facts keep lining up over here, and you are just struggling against the facts to still believe good of this person. One of the most painful things in my life was that exact struggle, and I see her in the middle of it, and it is hard to watch. Mrs. Kopechne wanted to talk to somebody who had attended the party at Chappquiddick. "I'd like to know what went on, what they were doing, what led to Mary Jo leaving, and what happened afterwards." The Kopechnes stayed at the Katama Shores Motel where their daughter had been lodged during the regatta weekend. It's very likely, actually, that all Mary Jo ever did at that hotel was change her swimsuit and head over to the beach. I don't know that they ever even slept a night in those beds. I think they dropped their gear, got ready to go to the beach, and then spent the rest of the day at Chappquiddick, and then she died that evening. But they stayed there that night. Chappquiddick continued to hurt the senator politically, but it didn't affect his reelection to the Senate in 1976. A request for security personnel got Bernie Flynn assigned as Senator Kennedy's bodyguard for a campaign fundraising party. When he was told to mingle inconspicuously with guests, Flynn engaged Jack Crimmins in conversation, and he disclosed he had been an investigator for the DA. "I'm the guy that helped the senator out," Flynn said. "I'm the one that told Stephen Smith about inquest evidence." Flynn observed Crimmins in conversation with Senator Kennedy a short time later, standing like 10 feet away. "I just happened to turn around at the right moment to catch Crimmins whispering in his ear. Kennedy was looking right at me with a startled look on his face. So I guess Crimmins told him who I was." After the political affair, Kennedy invites Flynn up to a private steak and lobster dinner in Plymouth. There's a photo of it. Flynn wanted to have his photo taken with the senator, and Kennedy was happy to oblige his Chappquiddick benefactor. Kennedy did win re-election for the Senate, but the beneficiary of Watergate was Jimmy Carter. Kennedy's supporters began reviving rumors that he's going to run for president in 1980, but listen to this. This is a different posture than we have seen. The Kopechnes returned to Edgartown in 1978. They threatened to go on national television and ruin Kennedy if he tried to run for president. But by 1979, they had changed their mind again. They still didn't know the full accident story, they said. And Gwen Kopechne said, "Everyone makes mistakes. If he runs, we won't interfere." So I don't know what's going on here except for her emotions. I'm not sure. Kennedy telephones the Kopechnes to express regret for another avalanche of publicity that would come on the 10th anniversary. In fact, much of the publicity could have been avoided if Kennedy himself had not granted so many interviews. He was now inviting reporters to ask him any questions they want about Chappquiddick, because I will answer them as I have answered them in the past. So he's trying to do the whole thing of, I'm an open book. I've answered all the questions. There's been no questions that I wasn't willing to answer. Anybody that wants to come at me, come at me. We can talk about all this. I've been really open about all this. I have nothing to hide. But the answers, the Washington Post complained, seemed almost memorized. An interview with the senator about Chappquiddick was a distinctly unenlightening exercise, frequently punctuated by denials before the questions are even finished. "Many of the actions that I was involved in on that night were irresponsible," Kennedy said. He had confronted issues of war and peace in public life, and I felt no hesitancy about involving myself in them and taking stands on many of them. Kennedy said he hadn't been asked a new question about Chappquiddick in 10 years. There hasn't been a new fact that has questioned the position I stated at the time of the tragedy, and there cannot be. No information would ever challenge his sworn testimony because it doesn't exist. I think it's interesting. He doesn't say because that's the facts, but because the evidence doesn't exist. I think this is a tell that he knows that absolutely there would have been evidence about this, but it's all been destroyed or hidden or purchased so that none of it can be proven anymore. Chief Arena actually shared that view. In the 10 years since the accident, no one has ever found anything to support more than what I initially charged him with. Still, one question plagued Arena. What had gone on from the time of the accident and Kennedy's report the next morning? Arena wasn't sure that he himself could vote for Kennedy if it came down to it. I certainly couldn't wipe Chappquiddick out of my mind. I still think the whole case deserves scrutiny. You had the front row seat, Chief Arena. You should have done that. We were talking about that back in Chapter 2. When Ronald Reagan was asked about if there were any other issues besides Chappquiddick that would defeat Senator Kennedy, Republican candidate Reagan replied, "Well, you mentioned one pretty good one." Yeah, Chappquiddick's enough. You don't need anything else. It is the full display of his character, of his judgment, of his instincts, of his machine and how he can get it to work for him even when it's against truth? Yeah, that's enough. That one incident is enough. By June 1979, Kennedy was leading President Carter better than 2-1 in public opinion polls. All signs were pointing to Kennedy positioning himself for the run. Carter dismissed these opinion polls as an accurate gauge. He said, "We've had some crises where it required a steady hand, a careful and deliberate decision to be made, and I don't think I panicked in the crises." An observation regarded as a coded reference to the senator's failure to report his accident for 10 years. I mean, Carter, who I want to note has just passed away in the last week, he was not regarded as a particularly successful president. In fact, I was a political science student, so I can say this, that well before his death, when I was going through college 25 years ago or so, he was regarded as pretty near the top of the list of worst presidents, not because of character. In fact, his character was stellar. But because of inefficiency, because of inaction, because of sort of a paralyzed and ineffective administration. So, yeah, but in this regard, he's right, that no one questions my judgment in a crisis. No one has said that I've panicked. And so that's a good attack line, honestly. And for a good Baptist boy who didn't say many mean things, that's a very honest and good jab for him to have made. Kennedy denied forbidding anyone to talk to the press, and he says, "Some have engaged in interviews and conversations and some have not. I left that entirely to their discretion." So he's saying, I never silenced anybody. Chappquiddick had not figured at all in Kennedy's decision to seek the nomination, Stephen Smith says. The only major negative, as always, was an assassination fear, but the judgment of everyone was, you can't let that rule your life forever. Kennedy had made it known that his family was ready for him to run if he was. So we're right up to the 1980 line. Chapter 56 observations are, Ted Kennedy's presidential star seems to be burning out. The Kopechnes start to crack open the door of unanswered questions, but ultimately still blame Gargan and Markham, not Ted Kennedy. Although sometimes they kind of toy with blaming Ted Kennedy and threatening things, but then they do nothing. Questions remain, and the public sentiment seems worse with time. But he's still toying with the presidency. Chapter 57, this is our last one. Kennedy was apparently not so ready as he thought. On September 29th, 1979, I just want to say, y'all, this is 2 weeks before I was born. I'll pause for just a moment to say that I've had some commenters here lately kind of give some snarky comments like, yeah, we all know about Chappquiddick. And I just want to say, I don't know all about Chappquiddick. I only learned about it for the first time in full because of the movie. I had heard it referenced by my parents and grandparents as a indictment of Ted Kennedy's character, but I did not know the facts of the case until I saw the movie, realized what all the hullabaloo was about, and then went back and started paying attention. But that's why I'm reading the book. So not all of us feel, yeah, all those facts have been known, because this was 55 years ago. This was a long time ago. And so we all are not at the place of saying, oh, this is no big deal. We all know these facts. That's precisely why I'm reading this book, is because this all happened. Everything we've read all happened before I was even born. Now we're getting to the part where it's close to when I was born. So little baby me could have read these articles, but that's why we're reading the book. So to answer the snark, that's why. On CBS News, Roger Mudd, he had arrived in Hyannisport to conduct an interview, and he tosses out the question that he thinks Senator Kennedy is just going to be able to hit out of the ballpark, no problem. He says, do you think, Senator, that anybody really will ever fully believe your explanation of Chappquiddick? And Kennedy completely struck out. He says he had found his behavior beyond belief himself. As part of a 1-hour documentary special, about half was devoted to the accident. This man Mudd asked Kennedy about other women in his life and characterized his marriage as existing only on select occasions. Yeah, at that point, Joan, or Jonesy, as he called her, was only around really for campaigns and besides that, they didn't live in the same place. They didn't really see each other. They had almost nothing to do with each other. In an atmosphere of euphoria and great expectations, Kennedy formally announced his candidacy on November 7th. But the promise of that candidacy proved to be more seductive than the candidacy itself. His campaign disintegrated a month later, and Chappquiddick was partly responsible. Kennedy was having trouble attracting the support from politically attractive women on the liberal side. Feminists, like Betty Friedan, still felt queasy about Chappquiddick. By January, Kennedy's advisors were preoccupied with the impact Chappquiddick was having on the campaign. The issue had been seriously misjudged, they decided. Kennedy had allowed himself to be misled by pollsters and friends. Hitherto undiscovered evidence relating to tides and topography placed a crucial element of his story in doubt. This is interesting. And this relates to my theory that I'm going to share at the end. Aerial photographs taken on May 15th, 1969, so right before the accident, had revealed that the Katama opening had sealed off, which made Chappquiddick not an island separate from Edgartown. A rising tide no longer flowed out of the harbor, but in a reverse direction from what Kennedy described in his testimony. So tides, cover-ups, which direction the car was going, and more. There were publications of controversies afresh. And thus, Kennedy's campaign is newly assaulted and haunted by Chappquiddick. Spectators in Chicago spit on the candidate and called him a killer as he went down the state street in a parade. A retired doctor carried a sign, "Do you want the coward of Chappquiddick for president?" Negative feelings toward Kennedy are growing each month, reported the Washington Post. Nearly half of Democrats nationwide had unfavorable views of him. This completely reversed the polls that had been done in November. Voters have not forgiven that he got away with it in 1969 and thinks he can get away with it again in 1980. Bernie Flynn, who had helped and bent the rules to help Kennedy, he had also had a change of heart. He said, "This man doesn't deserve to be president. I lost a lot of esteem for him." Flynn had had no contact with the senator and had never found it necessary to cash in that job insurance policy that he thought he was getting back in 1969. After 32 years in law enforcement, he had had enough, and he retires from the state police in 1980. Stricken with cancer, George Killen had retired in 1975, and 2 months before his death in 1979, Killen was still lamenting Chappquiddick as the biggest mistake I ever made. With the benefit of hindsight, Killen had dispensed with alternative theories to conclude that Senator Kennedy had been drunk, that he was in flight from Huck Look to avoid arrest and probably speeding at the time of his accident, that his own recklessness was responsible for the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. Chappquiddick was equally fatal to Kennedy's presidential aspirations in 1980. The senator made a spectacular appearance at the DNC on August 12th. He declared, "The dream shall never die." But his campaign had been a long struggle to overcome the stigma of Chappquiddick. And in the pursuit of the presidential nomination, Kennedy had basically run against Chappquiddick, and Chappquiddick won. By July 82, polls were reporting that Kennedy was the leading candidate for the presidential nomination in 1984. Money is being raised, and Kennedy hopes to use the election as a laboratory to test how they can defuse Chappquiddick. He feels that this is partly a run for the 1984 presidential sweepstakes, but door-to-door polling reveals that the character issue is a bigger factor than it was in 1976, so people are getting more and more clear on who the Kennedys are. Time is not actually erasing this problem, it's making it more clear in people's eyes. A 40-page comic book was sent to 2 million Massachusetts households that portrayed him as a chubby black sheep and zeroed in on his history of cheating at Harvard, his Virginia traffic violations, and Chappquiddick. Gargan says the funny thing about it was all true. Working on the campaign as usual, Gargan was taken to task by Ted Kennedy. Gargan had finally joined Alcoholics Anonymous. He says he was involved in a courageous struggle to put his life back together. And this is how he apparently exploded at Ted Kennedy. He says, "I've given you 30 years of my life, and what do I have to show for it? I'm a fool in the eyes of my own children because of Chappquiddick, and that's your problem, not mine." One day, Gargan said he wanted the real story of the accident to be told. He stormed out of the campaign and resisted all overtures to return. Because he had been a fixture in campaigns for decades at this point, Gargan's absence was too conspicuous not to be accounted for, and the office explained the senator's gradual drift from close friends such as cousin Joe Gargan, with whom he has clashed on the sensitive issue of abortion. So they pulled in a political issue rather than saying what was really true. Despite the huge expenditure of campaign money, Kennedy ran less than well in 1976. The outlook for a presidential candidacy was not as promising as his advisors had hoped. One advisor suggested outgrowing Chappquiddick by 1988 and the years beyond, when a voter might view a man in his 50s more kindly for the indiscretions of his 30s. So he actually cites family responsibilities and says he will not run in 1984. He didn't rule out the presidential candidacy in the future. "I don't think it's any mystery that I would like to be president," he said. He denied he had withdrawn because of public doubts about his character stemming from Chappquiddick, but an aide confirmed that the senator had feared the impact on his children of another round of accusations and inquiries about his role in the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. For the first time in 24 years, a Kennedy was not a figure to be reckoned with at the DNC. That's interesting. Events would prove Kennedy lucky to have withdrawn from presidential contention early. In August of 1983, Robert Kennedy Jr., the man who now has run for president in 2024, was arrested for possession of a gram of heroin. And in April 1984, the death of David Kennedy from an overdose of cocaine, prescription painkillers, and tranquilizers at a hotel in Palm Beach also was revealed. When that happened, Senator Kennedy telephoned authorities to request the body of his nephew be removed so that the investigation could be conducted in a less public setting. But this was Florida, not Massachusetts. Efforts to suppress information about the case didn't work. That same man who was the shadow lawyer of Chappquiddick, who went and met with Bernie Flynn in the airport, Herbert Miller, he now comes on as representing the Kennedy family in this tragic time. So he's still around. Kennedy people keep their people around. Well, we are on the last page of information. Kennedy kept a low profile until after the 1984 elections, but in December of 1984, so right after the election, he starts going on various kind of world tours. One was to Ethiopia to investigate famine, South Africa to study the racial problem of apartheid. And as he goes around kind of doing these, the Financial Times put Kennedy on its cover with the headline, "He's teaching us morals." An editorial inside recalled the accident at Chappquiddick. And so he's being raked over the coals still, which is great, actually, that the media is doing its job. An aide confirmed, however, that Kennedy was seriously considering a run for president. He's going to make a decision sometime in the second half of 1985. Kennedy had made it clear, "I want very much to be president. I know I can make a difference." Right, because that's what he cares about. This is just an unabashed power grab by him. Kennedy's staff had been instructed to assume that there would be a presidential candidate and to begin preparing themselves for it. But a Boston Globe survey of Democratic state chairmen offered little encouragement. One chairman observed, "The Chappquiddick situation will just kill him as far as ever being elected president. You just hear it on the street. People still remember." Interestingly, so for any British friends joining us, and also those of you who haven't brushed up on your government facts, presidential elections, of course, happen every 4 years. Senate elections happen every 6. And so there are many times in which a particular Senate seat might not line up with a presidential one. So every 6 years. So let's say it's here, then next time it's going to land here, then next time it's going to land here, etc. So you only hit simultaneous president and Senate seats from time to time. For the first time, though, for his particular seat, Kennedy would have to give up his Senate seat to seek the presidency. A loss would mean oblivion. So he's got to pick, am I going to run for president or am I going to run for the Senate again, for this seat that I've had locked up since 1960, I guess, before 1960. On December 19th, 1985, Kennedy produced a video, purchased time on 2 Boston television stations to announce his intention not to run for president in 1988. A grave Kennedy addressed the camera in a manner reminiscent of his Chappquiddick speech to announce, "I know that this decision means that I may never be president, but the pursuit of the presidency is not my life. Public service is." For 16 years, the ghost of Chappquiddick had hovered over his career, resisting all efforts to persuade the public that the real story had been told. No historian but a poet could inscribe the epitaph for the death of the Kennedy dream. Chappquiddick, Chappquiddick, your syllables echo the sea. Your rhythm caught the vulnerable note, shattered the walls of a dynasty. And that's the end of the book. So our chapter 57 observations before we move into our speculative theory time is that articles, speeches, public figures, polls, everything pointed to concerns about Chappquiddick and concerns about character every time. In 1980, Chappquiddick took the lead, took the focus, and he ended up not running. He had his final split with Gargan at this point. Then in 1984, the divorce took his focus, and so he didn't run. In 1988, because he had to choose between the Senate and the presidency, he chose the Senate. Those are my observations there. And so we have officially ended Chappquiddick. But now I'm going to share with you what I think happened. And I want to say a few things so that I hopefully don't have to add too many caveats. What I'm doing here, I would say I feel 60% sure, maybe 70% sure that something along these lines happened. I will say, I think what he said in these chapters that we've just read today is true, that no one would find any evidence to the contrary of what he said. And I think that is because the evidence had been destroyed. So it's actually similar to the JFK assassination in that when intelligence forces, when government forces, when there are legal forces that are keeping certain information withheld or doing some of the legal dancing that they did with the inquest where they took it into sort of a legal format, but then the DA did not actually pursue all the facts. So now the facts are inaccessible to us. Evidence was destroyed, burned, scrapped, etc. The facts are not going to be known, and some of it is unknowable, but here's what I think happened, okay? The first thing is, it for sure involved hanky-panky. I think I can say that unequivocally. But I don't necessarily think it involved Mary Jo. I suspect that there was a person that I will call Madam X. I've heard reports of this, and I think that the existence of this Madam X would resolve a great many questions and many pieces of data that I'm going to share with you. But this theory does not hinge on there being a Madam X. If you think there was no Madam X, you can just insert Mary Jo as the person with whom he was sneaking off to have inappropriate physical interactions with. But here is part of why, and we read it today, here is part of why I believe there's a Madam X, and I also believe that Mary Jo was not the person on whom his affections rested. Rosemary Keough said, Mary Jo got into the car. She was in the wrong car at the wrong time with the wrong people. And here's what I think happened. I think Mary Jo got into the back of the car. I think she was willing to go to the hotel and just kind of like, take me along with you. You know, we'll all head in that direction. And Ted and Madam X do whatever they do. Mary Jo perhaps is passed out in the back seat. Who knows? I don't think she was necessarily a part of it. I will say that. But if she was, then she was. Another piece of evidence that points to this is that Huck Look said he saw 2 or 3 persons. He said he saw a man and a woman in the front seat, and what he thought was the shape of a person in the back seat, but it could have been a pile of coats or parcels. And so I think that was Mary Jo. I think what happened is that after Huck Look sees them, they back out. He sees them go off in a huff, and he just goes on his way. I think right there in that little drive, they stop. Ted Kennedy and whoever gets out. And he says, just drive around and then come back to the cottage after a while. I think that's what happened. So Mary Jo gets up in the front seat and unfortunately drives herself down that road. We heard testimony about how the glare of the headlights makes a beam of light almost go straight up so that you could barely see the bridge until the last split second. And I think that's what happened. I think also that explains the injuries. We were told that there was perception that anybody who would have been riding in the passenger seat would have gotten a frontal head trauma from the windshield, and we didn't see that. And so we didn't see that on Mary Jo. She wasn't completely covered in shards of glass. She didn't have big contusions or that sort of thing. And so she was there. She gets thrown into the back seat, and then she is there struggling for air for some length of time. Was it as long as John Farrar? We don't know. There's no way to tell. I do have thoughts, though, about her a little bit more here in a minute. But she drives herself into the pond, is my assertion. Ted goes across. If you remember, in chapter 39, I believe, there's a boat described. And we're told that there were 3 people on it, which I think would be Joey, Ted, and Madam X. We're told that they go across, that there's hushed voices in this boat coming from Chappquiddick to Edgartown. This is a completely unrelated observer who just saw these things. He said he heard hushed voices of 3 persons going across. They come to Edgartown. They're moored there for a minute. And then that a larger boat engine fires up and goes back to Edgartown. And after 5 minutes, the other boat, which seemed to have been idling, he said, as if it was watching to make sure the coast was clear, then it takes off as well. So I think what happened is the big boat takes Ted and Madam X wherever. And they are doing their little get her off the island, make sure nobody knows about her. Now, the accusation that I heard about Madam X, I will say, is that she was an intelligence-connected person and that for whatever reason, her identity could not be known. And this gives credibility as to why cover-up would have had to have happened, why he would be willing to admit these things, etc. Regardless, let's say Madam X doesn't exist. Then the 3 persons on the boat at that point, in my little moment there, Paul Markham is still back at the harbor of the ferry dock there, and he's waiting in the car. But let's say there's 3, and it's Ted, Joey, and Paul. Then they come across and they go. Regardless, there's boats involved, and they're crossing at 2 a.m. is what was described. Remember at 2:25, the clerk says he thought it was Joe. He thought it was Joey Gargan. And he says that in his first statement, that he thought it was Joey Gargan. He seemed tall. He said it was the same accent as Ted Kennedy, but he didn't think it was Ted Kennedy. And I don't either. I think he encountered Joey Gargan trying to give he says he stayed back in the shadows. So he's trying to give an alibi for Ted. But Ted is off doing whatever with Madam X in my little world of this. Then everybody's focused on hiding the evidence for this third party and getting her off the island, as well as giving Ted the alibi. Now, Gargan goes back to the cottage, and at this point, he thinks that Mary Jo could still be circling or whatever, and he lays down in front of the door. He's not panicked, although he's aware, but he's tired, and he thinks we already did the job. We got this third party off of the island. Ted's taken care of. There's an alibi. He lays down in front of the cottage door, thinking when Mary Jo comes back with the car, she'll push the door into me. I can catch her up on what happened, and we'll all go to bed. At some point, panicky, I think he wakes up. He and Paul go down to the dock. I don't know if this would be 4, 5, 5:30, 6 a.m., but they go down and realize she never came back. I think then is when the segment that Joey describes actually happened. That then he dives down. Paul Markham's useless. He's sleepy, whatever. He's got a bad leg anyway. But Joey keeps going down and going down. I think he did end up in the car. I think he felt her leg at that point and knew that she was dead. And that's why there was no more attempt. And then he and Paul go across to inform Ted the next morning. Remember, they come, the observers said these people looked disheveled and wet, that they looked a mess. They go up and they tell Ted directly, you must go into the room. We have to talk to you right now. And prior to that, Ted is happy-go-lucky talking about the regatta. Why? Because he doesn't know. So that's my contention, is that Ted didn't know until this moment that it had happened. So then as they go into the room, we're told that there were heated voices. And they're basically, I think, saying, look, a girl is dead. This was all to get your Madam X out of the picture, or this was all to get you off the island, whichever way you want to see it, that's fine. My theory doesn't rest on the presence of Madam X, although I will say I think it makes his willingness to take ownership of this more credible, more understandable. But they say, you have to own this. We're not going to own this. We were willing to do these other things for you. We're not going to own a dead girl. And he basically is like, why do I have to be the one to do it? And they say, well, the girls all saw you leave together. They know that she was with you last and that you were the one driving. You have to take ownership of this. Did anybody else see you? Well, yeah, actually, there was a police officer. You have to own this. Okay, that's what I think happened in that moment. So then, what do? Do they go to the police officer? No. They decide, well, why do I have to be the one driving? I could say that she took the thing, which is exactly what they say happened in this conversation. I could say she took the wheel. I could say she drove herself. Why couldn't I say that? So then what they do is they go to the island. Remember, the three of them go across. And I think the reason they went across the island was not to get him information about the accident. Joey already had that. I think they go across to talk to the girls. I think at this point, they have to get their stories straight, and they know it. And it's a ticking time bomb. If everybody starts waking up and starts going down and finding the accident or talking or screaming, anything, they've got to get a handle on this. And so they go to the island, not to do anything, not to make the phone call like they suggest. They're going to talk to the girls. But they have to stop to make the call to the lawyer. And when they do that, remember, Paul Markham sees the tow truck coming across. And so then it's all out panic. That we don't have enough time. I'll go back and handle the girls. You get across and you report the thing now, or else the story becomes you were caught, you fled the scene of an accident, you've tried to hide it, you've tried to minimize the truth, and then all hell breaks loose. Okay, but I'm going to go try to tamp down the girls, but you have to take responsibility for the accident. And you just say you went off, you were in a daze, and now you're reporting it. So Ted Kennedy, without hardly any forethought, to me, this explains the ridiculousness of the statement that he made. It explains him not being injured, him being able to just kind of sprint as he gets off the ferry because he wasn't in the accident. And also the kind of messy nature of the way everything is reported is because he literally just found out about it like 30 or 45 minutes before he goes to report the thing. So he knows what Joey has told him about it. He knows the position of the car because Joey's expressed what's happened. He's told him what's happened, and he can give those kinds of details. But all of it's just a mess that doesn't make any sense because it literally has been constructed. It's a snap decision. He goes ahead and does it, and he regrets it from then on. I think now he's stuck with the story, and he's stuck with his regrets. So that's my theory that weaves together. Whether or not you have a Madam X, it does weave together. Mary Jo got into the wrong car at the wrong time with the wrong people. It explains Hug Look seeing 2 or 3 persons. It explains why the car drove off the bridge, even though Ted was very familiar with the accident and knew where he was. Mary Jo did not. It explains why Paul and Joey walk up wet the next morning. It explains that there must have been something else bigger that Ted Kennedy didn't want discovered, which is why he was willing to admit to something like this. And it explains other things too. But I think this, as far as I can tell, gives the best piecing together of the information that we have. You guys let me know in the comments what you think about this. I think Barney Flynn's theories could be true, that the drunk thing and the hanky-panky and whatever, but I don't think those fully explain why he would take credit for something like this. And I think this one does, that there's somebody else involved whose identity cannot be known. There's something else being protected, and therefore he was willing to kind of take credit for all of this in order to make all of this go away. And he didn't fully think it through because there wasn't that much time to do so. He just made a snap decision and was stuck with it the rest of his life. You tell me in the comments, have you enjoyed the book? Tell me your theory. Sit down. I have to tell you, I wrote down what I think happened. And I just started with that. What do I think happened from the start? What does my gut think happened? And of course, I have the benefit of this book, so I could flip back, read chapter 39, reread the story of the boats coming back and forth and that sort of thing. But I want to hear what you really think happened. Tell me your theory. Tell me what you think fits the evidence best. Maybe between us, we can discover it. We might not even know that we've discovered it, but maybe all of us together could come up with that. And also, I would say, maybe there's the possibility that somebody's diary or deathbed confession will actually give us the information that we want. Seems doubtful at this point, but possible. Well, with all of that, I just want to say, you guys, I have enjoyed this so much. I kind of am sad that we're ending this little time together, but it's been very good and I hope you've enjoyed it. I want to point you in the direction of, if you haven't ever watched it, I went through the whole book, Ask Not, which is all about the Kennedys. There's one chapter on Chappquiddick, but all the rest are equally shocking stories involving Kennedys. So if you haven't seen that, you may want to go to my channel, to the list of playlists, and watch that. We've gone through the whole book of Melania, the autobiography of Melania Trump. And then I have done a lot in the past few months on the Kennedy assassination, and I have a whole playlist about that. And then now we are going through Tina Brown's The Palace Papers. And so I want to invite you to join me for that. We have moved through the early years of Camilla and the Diana situation and all of that. And we have just gotten to the part where the Queen Mother and Margaret passed away in 2002. And now Queen Elizabeth is sort of solo for the first time. She is the only one from us four, which was her father, mother, sister, and herself. And all of a sudden in 2002, of course, her father died initially, and that left just the three of them, but then her mother and sister go. And so now she is the only one remaining from us four. So that's the point we're at right now in this series. I'd love to invite you to join us, but let me know in the comments what you've appreciated and enjoyed and learned about Chappquiddick. And I want to hear that. I can't wait to read your comments. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and we'll hopefully see you soon on some of those other books. Take care. Bye.